Welcome to Live with the Louhs with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Live with the Louhs. We are so happy that you've taken the time to join us this Tuesday evening. I know it's a busy evening for most of us. I'm Dr. Roxanne Lowe, as many of you know, and together, Father Nicholas and I, we co-host this show really as an extension of our ministry. And it's really our attempt at sort of merging the principles of faith with the study of human behavior to really better equip us in managing our everyday issues with our faith as our guide. Tonight, Father Nicholas is actually away. He's speaking at a retreat in California. And hopefully he gets a chance to tune in, but I'm not so sure with that time difference. As always, we want to remind you, this is a live call-in show. And so if our topic has you thinking or processing or, really reflecting on your own life, we'd love to hear from you. You can give us a call anytime throughout the show. The number into the show is 1-855-237-2346. Again, that number is 855-237-2346. We also welcome your written questions and comments throughout the show. You can email us and even ask anonymous questions. You can send us an email at ask@ancientfaith.com. We also are streaming live on Ancient Faith's social media pages, and we will be watching those throughout the show to bring up your comments as time allows. And don't forget, as always, we try to mention this because us, just like all of you, we need a little inspiration and we need encouragement. I don't know about you guys, but I have so many apps on my phone and pages that I've liked that as I bring up and just sort of look throughout my social media, I'm encouraged in ways that I didn't even know that I needed until I read it. And so we try to bring you a little bit of encouragement through our own Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And you can find us all under the heading of The Louhs. That's Louhs, The Louhs. And if you haven't liked our pages, please do so. You can also hit share and encourage your friends with our daily inspirational messages. You can also jump on our website if you'd like to get them through your email inbox and subscribe to them by putting in your email at the subscribe button on our Louhs website. That's Louhs.com. Well, tonight we are going to be talking about adoption. And here to join us tonight is Dr. Ashley Lackovich. Dr. Ashley is a Serbian Orthodox Christian, nonprofit strategist, and global child protection leader. She holds a PhD in leadership and change, and she applies field-tested solutions from Ethiopia and Syria, and I'm sure many of her field placements along her journey, and to her consulting work with children and education in the United States. As co-founder of Enhance Worldwide, Dr. Ashley has measurably advanced girls' educational opportunities in Ethiopia. She is also an author for Ancient Faith, and her book is entitled Children of My Heart. If you haven't gotten your copy and you enjoy tonight's show and you know anybody who's dealt with adoption or is currently adopting or thinking about adopting, we strongly encourage you to check out Children of My Heart. She's also a member of the Diocesan Education Commission of the Serbian Orthodox Diocese of Eastern America. So, Dr. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So happy you could be with us tonight. You've spent most of your career, working with vulnerable populations, vulnerable children all over the world, it sounds like. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your story and a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So I lived and worked internationally for about 15 years. Actually, I came back to the U.S. right before the pandemic, so it was beautiful timing. And most of that time I was implementing, designing, and eventually leading programs that protected the rights, health, and well-being of children in vulnerable situations. And those vulnerable situations were mostly the result of conflicts wars, or situations of extreme poverty. And I'm sure, as you know, children are always disproportionately impacted by any type of crisis. And so the needs of children in those situations are just so vast. And that's the work that I was doing all over the place. I was in Ethiopia for about 5 years, working mostly on education programs with children. A lot of those were programs like alternative basic education programs for street children. They were also education programs that acted as a protective factor, so keeping girls from human trafficking and child marriage. And that's where I ended up founding my nonprofit. And that nonprofit still exists, and we still do that work to keep girls in the capital city with their families and out of institutions like orphanages, and also away from trafficking and child marriage. Otherwise, what else? I was in the DR Congo, in Kenya, spent several years in Israel, Palestine, and tried to come back to the US once before whenever I was doing my PhD work, and taught for a couple of years, but really felt called to go overseas again with the Syria crisis. So spent 3 years living in Jordan, but working with children throughout the region. First went there with the UN Refugee Agency to develop some guidance on preventing and responding to child marriage in the Syrian crisis, but ended up staying for several years to work on different programs with adolescents, displaced Syrian girls, as well as girls from throughout the region who were impacted by the war. So I love the work. It was wonderful. But then came back here right before the pandemic, and was very thankful that I wasn't overseas during closures and shutdowns.
That is, such meaningful work. And having just watched The Sound of Freedom not too long ago, my heart just broke and opened in response to, wow, there's a world that exists in our periphery at all times that we're not always in awareness about. Yes. I'm curious as to sort of what opened your eyes to this mission, and maybe how you got into this line of work.
I think it's actually exactly what you said. I, had intended to get a PhD. I did get a PhD, but I intended to get one in foreign languages. I was studying German and French, and I wanted to be a university professor. But I ended up going overseas to do some volunteer work. And it was seeing that and realizing that there is this other world that exists. And now I had seen this world. So I think that there is a responsibility sometimes that comes with knowing, seeing, and experiencing. So then how, do I go back to my German poems and my French literature when there's this other reality that I'm privy to and should be doing something about? So that really, has been my drive.
Wow. What a beautiful way to inspire people toward their own purpose, that we're all waiting to kind of discover when we're exposed to things. You have 3 children, including a son you adopted in May. Could you share with us a little bit about your own journey with adoption?
Sure. So I have 2 daughters, and they are now 16 and 13, very soon to be 17 and 14. And I adopted them when they were about 4 and 10 months old. So it's been a minute for sure. It goes so fast. And they are from Ethiopia. And we adopted them when we were actually living and working in Ethiopia. We were in Ethiopia for about 5 years. And they were adopted then. And years later, in May, we traveled to Serbia, we, including the girls, to complete the adoption of a 10-year-old boy. So he's still quite new to the family and still learning English and adjusting not only to the family, but to the American culture and also to the unique Serbian diaspora culture that he's suddenly found himself in.
Wow. So it sounds like there's a big difference between adopting an infant and adopting a 10-year-old, especially considering that an infant has likely experienced, maybe less trauma than an older child, but not necessarily. We also know that there's just such a profound experience that infants have in not having sufficient caregiving at such a young age. Even some of our, ventral vagal responses that provide calmness are not developed, we know, because research is showing us, in kids who are not appropriately soothed when they're young. I mean, that develops in response to connection. So so I imagine that there's a difference between infant and 10-year-old. What's it been like to just adopt kids with these sort of complex backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, all three of my children were adopted at different ages and with different complex backgrounds. So, I mean, I think in that sense, it's been three unique experiences. Adopting Daria, her name is Daria, as an infant, she had spent her entire life in an orphanage, and it was a very good orphanage. I've been to many orphanages in many countries, and this one was well staffed, and she had nutritious food and a loving environment, but she did not have the benefit of bonding with just one caregiver. So, and did not have the benefit of things like that cry response, right? You cry and you're instantly pacified or helped, or, whatever. Your needs are met, right? Because if you're one of 20 babies, your needs aren't going to be instantly met because you're one of many. So that was absolutely there when she was adopted. And that was actually something that we had to work on with her quite a bit, was when she cries, there's a response. When she wakes up at night, she cries and there's a response. And, that was sort of an early activity of bonding and attachment that I did quite a bit with her. And, so not to say that there isn't an impact, but, for her, it was those 10 months. And then there was a period of very intense bonding. We wouldn't let anyone feed her for a year. We wouldn't let people hold her and care, that we did very intentional things to try to reset the framework of what a what a parent or a caregiver is. And, to the frustration of my family and friends, as I'm sure you could imagine, right? I have my stack of books on how we're going to do this to try to support healthy bond and attachment, but it very much goes against sort of the community embracing of a baby or a child. So, yeah. So the interesting times. But, on the other hand, she's now been with us over 13 years of her life out of 14. So all of her core memories have been formed here with us. She has no memories of any other life, right? She'll see a picture, but it's just not a part of her reality. So, that's a very different experience than, say, adopting her sister, who was 4 when we brought her from the orphanage. So she did have memories and a complex history, even though it was only 4 years of a history. A lot had happened to her in 4 years. But then there's also the social implications. I mean, we adopted her and she was in an orphanage. So, her life was so different. She was not accustomed to family, right? Not like a child who's coming from foster care, or even a child who's coming from a household that, may have abuse. There's still the structure of a household. She was coming from a situation where she had to eat at a certain time and go to bed at a certain time, but otherwise she just did whatever she wanted. So, hearing no and seeing boundaries, that was a huge adjustment for her. And she's cool. We joke about it now, but it's like, Lydia, I have bite marks, right? We're talking those kind of behaviors because it was just not her world, right? She just wasn't socialized to be in that kind of environment. Versus a 10-year-old. And, a 10-year-old, has a different level of maturity and awareness. And so even though there's even more of a complex history, right, he doesn't have the mentality of a 4-year-old, right? Alexander knows biting me is not going to be very effective in getting what he wants. So he uses other strategies. So 3 very, very different experiences. And for him, it's all still very new and fresh. And, we just adopted him in May and it's March. So this time last year, we didn't even know each other. So a lot happens in a year.
Well, I imagine that there are many parents listening who have faced some similar struggles to what you're describing with your 4-year-old, in not having had the boundaries or even the consistency of an emotional attachment to be vulnerable toward. And so dealing with the defiance, dealing with the resistance, dealing with a lot of emotional dysregulation, I would imagine. I'm sure there are quite a few listeners, wondering what it was like as a parent to face those challenges, and really maybe how you navigated them, and maybe what you've learned through the process. I'm sure that they would appreciate your wisdom.
Yeah, sure. Oh gosh, how to navigate those things. I mean, what I've always found, what I try to center back on, and research shows warmth and routine, right? When we're dealing with children and when we're dealing with anyone who's been affected by trauma, right? Those are two of those core elements of love and structure that we can give that makes a difference. So I know for my children, routine matters so much. It has always mattered. And even as they go through the different ages and stages of life, having that predictability makes such a difference. I would say for any kids. I mean, I'm sure especially for kids who've experienced trauma, but, for any of us, because life is so hard. Life is so hard for kids in the world. It's so hard for all of us. And so when everything's going around like this, and you're like in the middle of a hurricane or a tornado, it's, you can center children and center yourself with that routine. So, my kids wake up at the same time, whether it's weekend or not. Then they have their morning routines and it's the same, right? There's no staying up late because it's just that consistency. And, we eat, together at a certain time. And, the after school, Alexander is now settling into learning that what do? We come home and lunchbox comes out, and after lunchbox comes out, there's just these structures and patterns. And I'm seeing now after he's been doing these things for a few months that he's settling into the comfort of that, because when nothing else is predictable, these daily things are predictable. So when I talk to parents, I always talk about the importance of routine. When I talk to parents, even sometimes about kids who struggle coming into the summer months, because that can be hard for children because they're used to that consistency of the school year. And then they enter the summer when, often, the idea is let kids relax and do whatever. And we talk about how important it is for them to have a somewhat predictable structure of a day. So I think that that's really important. I think the other thing is warmth. And I used to say love, but, love is expressed in so many different ways. And sometimes how we express love might not be how a child receives love. So I find that this idea of warmth, the warm voice, is what I like to use. The hug, the bringing them, how I, serve them food or whatever I happen to be doing. I think that can really create a feeling of being wanted and being seen in a place. So, you're combining the consistency and the routines and the safety of the space you're creating with that warm feeling of here I am and this is where I belong. So those, I think really are the key strategies that I've developed over the years with my own kids, but also, with the work I've done and seeing what works in group settings for children, or, also, with adults. I find that if I have my routine and my warm cup of tea, I'm doing better, right, than if I don't. So I think it can also apply to us.
Dr. Ashley, we have a question that came in via Facebook Messenger here from a parent who adopted a young girl from the Dominican when she was 3. And she says that the journey has been fraught with a lot of aggression, a lot of anger, a lot of dysregulation, a lot of pain. And despite, warmth and affection and predictability, that her daughter had a hard time accepting the attachment. And she's asking, what do you do when you feel the attachment never happened? The struggle to connect from the child to the parent. And the daughter is now 21. And so, what would you say to this mom who's talking about the struggle to feel connected to her daughter, not necessarily from her toward her daughter, but the daughter toward her?
Well, I think I would have a conversation with the daughter because the daughter is an adult. And, you know, I don't know what that experience would be like and what her reality is like. And maybe the mom doesn't know either, right? So, you know, to open up the lines of communication and, you know, see if there's a way that they can connect over a conversation and maybe develop strategies to create more of a connection. I mean, you know, I think about like with my children, and you know, I don't know how this would apply to a 21-year-old, so I'm thinking out loud, but one of the things that I have done with all three of my kids are activities that involve an invisible connection. Okay. I got this idea from a book called Parenting Your Internationally Adopted Child. Sorry, I can't think of the name of the author. I mean, I read this probably 12 years ago now, but it's an idea that stuck with me. And the concept was that in the perfect ideal biological setting, children and their parents feel connected to each other. There's a biological connection, especially mother to child, because it did originate as a physical connection. And when you have a child that you are taking in a different way, becoming a parent in a different way, to mimic that invisible connection that inherently exists with a baby or your biological child. So the author suggested games that entail a back and forth. So I used to sit with my daughter outside and we would roll a ball back and forth to each other. And the trick of rolling the ball is we always had to make eye contact. And we did this again and again over the course of years to try to symbolically build this invisible connection. And I have done quite a bit of soccer kicking with Alexander, with my son, you know, in the same kind of way to try to mimic that. And I don't really know if there's an age limit on that. So, I mean, if the daughter was open to a conversation, I might just be very honest about, this is what I feel and we are where we are. And, you know, I'm sorry this connection didn't develop, but how about if we try it? And maybe that means going back and adapting some children's activities like that for adults, or maybe that finds shared interests and, you know, undertaking different activities together. But I think, you know, at an adult level, I would see what she's feeling like and what ideas that she might have, because she would be the real expert on her experience.
Interesting
but
about the
like
eye contact. Yeah. Even games contact, yeah. And thinking that, you know, the back and forth of taking turns in something and sort of, you know, interesting with the hormones through eye contact. You know, I'm wondering what the neurobiology of that would be with the oxytocin and things like that. But yeah, so, but I do know that that's been a struggle for various people. How did your son, you know, connect into this pre-existing family, if you will? You know, he came a bit later. I'm sort of curious about families who are adopting a child, not all at the same time. How did you manage that transition for him?
Well, you know, I think the main way I actually managed was with my daughters. I mean, that was my concern because I certainly didn't want to do anything to disrupt their lives in a negative way. And, you know, from the information that I had about my son, he could have disrupted their lives in a negative way. And I was very aware of that. But I pulled them into the process right away. And I said, okay, you know, this is what I'm thinking. And what do you think about this? Because if either of them would have said absolutely not, I would not have been able to proceed, because they are adopting him too, right? Not just me. And then from there, we spent about a year, I mean, talking and talking and talking through all of the possibilities and all of the possible behaviors and all of the traumas. And it actually turned out to be a really positive experience for the girls, because it was a way for them to talk about their own experiences without talking about their own experiences. And by the time that we traveled to Serbia and met him, they were so ready to welcome him as their brother. And that made the transition so much easier. So, I mean, I credit them for a lot of why it went so well, to be honest. And then, I mean, honestly, I mean, I wish that I could, share some, story of struggle and triumph with him, but he really just fits in to the point that sometimes I have to say to the girls, remember everything we talked about, remember his background, right? He's only been here X amount of months. And then like the looks on their faces and they're like, yeah, right, you're right. And so it's almost been the problem that I didn't ever expected that I would have, right? Is that he's always been here, except he hasn't. And he's still working through a lot. And the girls very often forget that. So it's a bittersweet kind of thing. I mean, that's wonderful. Like it's the success story you want on one hand. But on the other hand, it takes away from, some of the special attention that he needs from all of us as he fully integrates into our life.
It sounds like you did a lot of work to prepare the girls. I love the idea of, I'm not the only one adopting him, to really take into consideration in a real way, authentic feelings and experiences of your entire family in thinking about integrating, a new child. It sounds like, I would imagine that your work, in your experience, just your vast experience in all of these situations has really sort of helped you connect and support your children in really specific ways. And maybe you could talk about that, because I know that for a lot of people in situations where they're bringing in a child with complex trauma, dealing with the emotional dysregulation that those kids experience in trauma. We know how trauma affects the body in profound ways that we're not even cognitively aware of. And we do have trouble regulating the body in those moments. I mean, I would imagine as a parent, that's hard to manage, and we don't always have a good tool set, to know how to walk through that journey with our children in ways that are life-giving. Do you feel like your background, with vulnerable situations really helped you to know how to navigate that in ways that maybe not every parent would know?
I think at the very least, it's giving me a different perspective because it's normalized trauma to me. Right. I mean, I've worked, trauma is something that so many people experience. And if I was just living, my life here, with my family, I might not see that. But, I worked with children who have trauma. And then I worked with colleagues who experienced trauma because of the work that they were doing. Right. So it to me has just become part of the human experience. So I think viewing it as part of the human experience for me takes the stigma away. And that certainly gives me more of a bandwidth for not just parenting, but I would say negative human interactions across the spectrum. So that really, I think, is probably the most specific tool. It's not really a tool, it's more of a perspective, right, that my work has given me. I think also, I would say that, in my work, having seen so many young people and children who are experiencing trauma, and seeing how they work through it and how difficult it can be, and then recognizing that it becoming really dark and difficult doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative. It means that they're working through things. So I think, with all three of the kids, I have been better able to see that, right? Looking at a behavior and, speaking of violent behaviors, and Lydia from an orphanage, she, and her very violent temper tantrums, but recognizing that she needs to be doing this, right? She's doing this for a reason. She's not able to regulate. And maybe the process of going through these motions or gestures are allowing her to do what she needs to do to piece the pieces together so that she is able to get to a better space. So,
so you really allowed for that. I mean, it sounds like you weren't reacting to it so much. I mean, it almost sounds like there was an invisible boundary between her emotional dysregulation and your reactivity, because you had a framework for allowing it.
On my best days, that's exactly it. allowing it, because I mean, I think like we talk about like having a good cry, right? Well, I mean, you know, a good cry does help a regulated adult with a mature perspective and control over their lives. But, you know, sometimes children who come from these backgrounds need a lot more than a good cry. So yes, I did allow quite a bit of it with with the girls in particular. And I do believe it was beneficial.
Did you see through your non-reactivity paired with your warmth and sort of patiently allowing this process to kind of felt like this invisible boundary, did you see it over time sort of calm the storm that they were managing? And did you see the tantrums get less intense, less frequent? I'm curious about that how that improved.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's just that, right? I mean, I was just so, including with my son, just, I read all of the books and did all of the studying and deciphered what strategies resonated with me. I mean, as you know, in psychology, you pick your method and you pick your framework, right? So I sort of had a toolbox that I was going to deal with, I was going to use and apply, and it was trial and error, and different kids have different needs. And then I think personality comes into play, right? So I think it was not just the allowing, but it was, the approach and everything else. I mean, I put it together and I adapted it for each need of each of my kids, because they are three very different kids with very different needs and very different personalities. Like that's the other thing that comes into play is just personality, is just who they are. And, and what they're comfortable doing or saying or their interests, and trying to put that all together to customize an approach that helps them when they need help.
That's just beautiful. And I'm sure it's a process like all of us parents that continues to adapt in every chapter of life. Well, we're going to take a quick break. And on the other side of this break, we're going to hear a little bit more about Dr. Ashley's even Orthodox framework on adoption. We'll be right back.
Live with the Louhs with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
Are you curious about the Orthodox Christian faith?
Do you have questions about Orthodox Christianity that you can't trust strangers in internet forums to answer?
Are you an Orthodox Christian looking for a reliable first place to send your interested friends?
Do you need help finding an Orthodox church near you?
My name is Father Paul Hodge. I serve in the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America.
My name is Father Joseph Lucas. I serve in the Orthodox Church in America.
My name is Father Anthony Cook. I serve in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America.
And I'm Father Andrew Stephen Damick, Chief Content Officer of Ancient Faith Ministries and a priest of the Antiochian Archdiocese. And we're the Orthodox Intro team.
If you're looking for a first stop online to get an introduction to the Orthodox faith,
a place to get answers to questions from qualified Orthodox Christian clergy,
a place to send your friends and not just toss them into the chaos of the internet,
a place to get help finding an Orthodox parish and get plugged into an actual Orthodox community, then point your web browser at orthodoxintro.org. Orthodoxintro.org is a free service of Ancient Faith Ministries and made possible by our donors. It's an Orthodox on-ramp to the Christian life. Again, that's orthodoxintro.org.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Louhs? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back to Live with the Louhs. We're thankful you're joining us this evening. We are speaking with Dr. Ashley Lackovich on the topic of adoption. So welcome back, Dr. Ashley. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you feel your faith has led you in this journey of adoption. And, you know, is your faith a call to action when it comes to adoption?
It definitely is for me. I, always say that with caution because, it's not for everyone, right? I know that a few years ago, actually, whenever I was adopting my children, many of my friends in more of the Protestant communities, it was a big push, right, that everyone should be adopting children. And I think for those of us who are called to adopt, it's a beautiful thing, but it is not for everyone, just the way monasticism is not for everyone, right? It is, for me, it is definitely a call and definitely is part of a spiritual pursuit. And I'm thankful that I do have this path. So yes.
Beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. What are some of the common misconceptions about adoption? I mean, you say it's not for everyone. I know there's probably a lot of ideas people have about adoption, and I'm sure it's laden with many misconceptions. What are some of the common misconceptions that are out there about adoption?
Oh gosh. There are so many misconceptions out there. I think, one of them is, that my daughters encountered is this, idea of your real mother, right? That, Ashley's not your real mother, especially when they were younger. Their peers would think that. And I think even some of their peer parents, and that was like always a really startling thing. Like, how is she not my real mother? She's not my biological mother, but she's very much my real mother. So I think, there's that misconception that, somehow, we're not as much of a real family as if we were a biological family. And, biological families, adoptive families, that, they're different, but it's, my kids are still very much my kids, right? Regardless of how our family became a family. I think other misconceptions that we encounter would be, the nurture-nature, biology versus environment debate. That's always something that's really interesting. My older daughter, Lydia, is, she's like my mini-me. She has my voice and she has my gestures, and she has my interests. And, it's really funny. Like, we'll be in a conversation and somebody will talk about something and she'll say that she got that from me so naturally, right? Not even thinking that, we are not genetically connected, because she, we are just so bonded and so attached, right? So I think, there's that misconception that there's always this distance. So that's a big one. What other misconceptions? Oh my gosh. I mean, there are just so many different things. And I think also the misconception that it's always a very complicated, turbulent, difficult thing. And, there are moments that are very complicated and turbulent and difficult, without a doubt. And some of those moments are absolutely specific to adoptive parenting. And adoptive parenting does take intentional work, especially around bonding and attachment. However, right, I mean, my relationship with my daughters right now, in particular, it's very typical. Most of our relationship, and I would say all of the challenges we're facing, are no different as if they were my biological kids. I mean, they're two teenagers, right? So we're doing the dance of adolescence, how to support independence while still parenting. And that is something that I share, with my friends who have biological children. So, so many different things out there. But it's a wonderful way to expand a family, whether you have biological children or not. I don't think that adoption has to be just for those who decide not to or cannot have biological children. I have friends who had biological children and then decided to adopt. So, all families are different and it works in different ways.
I'm curious about the conversation when you adopt an infant. At some point, there's a conversation that you were adopted. Or for some, that conversation maybe didn't happen for any number of reasons why parents may have felt they did not want to share it or didn't have the tools or didn't know how. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on when that conversation happens, how that conversation happens, whether that conversation should happen? Because I know that that's been a conversation that's existed in the periphery of adoption for a long time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in my opinion, the conversation never not happened, right? I mean, it was helpful to adopt an Ethiopian 4-year-old who, knew very well that she was adopted because she remembered everything. But even with, my younger daughter, it's part of their life story. And to pretend like it didn't happen would have been not seeing a very important part of who they are. And, now there are so many resources with that. There are so many books and stories and, ways to integrate those conversations into a child's life, naturally from the beginning on. So it's just, it's part of their identity. And we talk the same way about their birth stories or, as we would if they were biological children. It's just, different. And I think that, is probably also, kind of tying that into misconceptions. Some of the people I talk to who are interested in adoption or somehow adoption in their life, they have this fear that a friend told me, that her child was going to grow up and find their birth parents and not be their child anymore. And
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a thing.
This is a big one, right? Mm-hmm.
That's a big one. And I think, the birth mother doesn't make me any less their mother, right? It's we can extend our love and extend our relationships when that is appropriate, right? I mean, I understand that children in many situations, open adoptions and whatnot is, a complex thing. But it's not a threat. It's just part of the story and it's part of the family. I mean, I'm no more threatened by a birth mother than I am by my mother, who's my children's grandmother, right? It's another relationship that can just expand. And, if you're bonded and attached to the children, nothing's going to break that bond, right? It's there the same way. It's there with any biological children or any relationship that we nurture, right? We can have that, like we were talking about, that thread or that line between parent and child. And if you have a good line between parent and child, it can be pulled and it can be stretched, but it cannot be broken. And so I think that, when you enter in those kinds of relationships, then there aren't so many outside threats because you're secure in your own attachment.
That's a beautiful way to look at that as an extension of the family and a positive relationship that we're not threatened by. I do know that has been, just working with my own clients, some of the deepest fears of, if this is allowed to be part of their story and they meet their, birth parent, what happens to me? And so I'm glad you could speak into that with just, it's such a non-issue, that this is not something to fear, but a part of their story and not something that we need not approach. And I do think so often when we're fearful of something as parents, the desire is to not approach, it is to avoid. And so often, just like with fears, when we approach them, they lose sort of the power over us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the avoidance makes it worse, right? And grows it within us. So that's a beautiful way to think about it. And so thinking about parents who are in this position, what would you say you've really learned from your work, in the field or from your own parenting about parenting children with complex backgrounds? What are sort of your biggest nuggets of wisdom?
My biggest nuggets of wisdom. Well, I mean, I think for parents who are parenting children with complex backgrounds, or parenting children who don't have complex backgrounds, but their child's going through a particularly difficult stage, really is to take care of yourself. And I know that, in the Orthodox Christian community in particular, sometimes we kind of push back on that idea, especially as we approach Lent and we want to resist our indulgences and take on ascetic practices. But I recently heard Abbess Catherine Weston, a nun in the Serbian Orthodox Church, talk about self-care as an extension of our love to ourselves, right? So having mercy on ourselves. And that's very different than self-pity, right? That's very different than, giving in to indulgences or, weaknesses or however we want to look at it. But it's an act of mercy. And sometimes that act of mercy on the self can open us up to better care for others or better, respond to what God wants us to be doing in our lives. And I certainly have seen that acts of self-mercy have enabled me to parent my children better and be better in the world altogether. So I think taking care of yourself is what I would pass on as a nugget there.
You sound like you've had a very busy experience in life just through moving to all of these different countries.
So busy.
And what that really looked like on a daily basis. I imagine your work and then getting a PhD in the process and then adopting children, raising a family. You have a 91-year-old grandmother that you visit
yes,
now.
Thank you for remembering.
Yes, 4 hours away. And so yes. Life is full for you. As many, women listening to this show, we wear many hats. We, our brain is just a whole bunch of interstates running in different directions. And trying to manage the chaos is sometimes, challenges our self-mercy and self-compassion and self-care. How had you found the time to nurture yourself and to think about, things in merciful ways, towards yourself? Because sometimes our narrative can get very negative and very condemning, and we don't always make time to care for ourselves. How did you do that throughout your own journey?
I have been very fortunate because I love animals. And, when you have an animal, you have to care for the animal. And I got a cat early on and she went overseas with us. And then I got another cat and they both went overseas with us. And so part of my responsibility in the world is caring for my pets. And that to me is the ultimate act of self-care, because it takes me away from whatever it is that I'm doing, whatever it is that I'm worried about or thinking about or troubled about. And it puts me in the moment. So, I think finding that, right? Finding something that just gives you joy. And if you can incorporate it into your daily life, then it's a win-win. I have to feed the cats. And then that means I also have to take a few minutes for myself just to unwind and be present. So, trick yourself into self-care maybe, right? Make your self-care a responsibility.
I do love that. And animals can be so grounding, just the
so grounding
aesthetic of the touch, the physical touch,
yes.
The eye contact they give, they're grounding, right? And it kind of reminds us of where our body is in time and space, and we can kind of look around and see something real in the present, right? So no matter what we're worrying about or thinking about or dreading or remembering that was so hard, they do have a way of kind of bringing us to the present. And I do think that's something for everyone to think about, is what is that for them? What is that for us? That moment that brings us into our present awareness and something we can touch, feel, and connect to, that just slows life down for even just a few minutes. So what advice would you give people? There are people everywhere yearning for children, thinking about adoption, whether they have their own biological children or whether they have not been able to have their own biological children. What advice would you offer people who are thinking about adoption?
Well, as I said before, it's not, for everyone, right? And I think that given that it's not for everyone, there's kind of two pieces there, right? There's the head piece, right? There's a practical part about going into adoption, dealing with, complex backgrounds and trauma responses and behaviors, especially if you're looking to adopt an older child. And working through that and figuring out if that's something that you can take on, incorporating a child into your life, especially, an older child. I mean, these are things that I had to think about a lot this year that I didn't have to think about when I adopted an infant and a 4-year-old. But I mean, you're adopting a 10-year-old. What does that mean? Can that work in my life? And how do I make that work? And do I have the resources to make that work? So I think like the first part of it is, figuring out that head piece, right? And then the second part is the heart piece, because when you're adopting a child, you're bringing a child into your life, and that child deserves to be loved unconditionally, to be loved no differently if that child came from your body, to be accepted and to be embraced. And that's very much a matter of the heart. And in my experience, talking about it in terms of faith, that's the God piece to me, right? Is if the heart desire is there, and if that's what we're being called to do, then it's combining our head and our heart and moving forward and trusting, right? For me, it's about God. For others, it might be just trusting the process or trusting that they made the right decision, right? However, they're framing it, but moving forward with faith and with love and merging the head and the heart and doing all of the right things to make it work. I don't think that it's something, to be fearful of. I understand why there can be anxiety around a lot of that, but if, your heart's into it and you do all the right things with your mind, I think it will turn out pretty beautifully in the end.
How did you know it was your calling? It sounds like it was a calling for you, very much a heart
That's another
issue.
Hour. That's another hour.
I mean, you say you have to be the right
is...
person, right? I think people think about that all the time. Is this my calling? How do I know?
Well, I believe in discernment. I do. And I believe that we, part of our, purpose on life is to figure out, why we're here and what we're called to do. And for me, through various interactions and life experiences and places I ended up and people I met along the way, it became absolutely undeniable to me that this is what I was supposed to do. In so many ways. I mean, to talk about God messages, that's a whole that's a whole other thing. But I think it, it goes back to establishing a relationship with God and a spiritual practice and opening up our hearts and opening up our minds and moving forward and trusting that we are here to do what we are here to do, and that it will all happen according to His will. And that's the summary of another hour.
Sounds like, and people may be able to hear about that in your book, I'm sure.
Yes.
Children of my heart.
Yes.
We have about 5 minutes left here, and just in our final minutes, after watching Sound of Freedom, I just remember my heart feeling heavy, and I immediately started researching, what can I do? How can I help? It opened my mind to, researching even the industries of things I purchased. What were they, how were they made? Who made them? It just a number of things. And I began furiously reading for weeks from this just one film. And for those of you who haven't watched it, to our listeners, I would say it's definitely one to watch. But, for people listening, asking themselves, how can we support vulnerable children if we're not adopting, if we're not in the stage of life or chapter of our life where that fits our head and our heart? How would you tell our listeners that they could help support vulnerable children across the globe?
I think I would start with your circle of influence, right? Just being kind to children you meet. We don't know what other kids are going through. We don't know the traumas that kids are experiencing. We don't know who comes from an abused home. We don't know who suffered a death or a loss. We don't know who's struggling with bullying at school. I mean, there's so much there. So just to be kind to anyone in your circle of influence. I mean, I think it starts that small and that basic. And then, going out from there a little bit bigger, volunteering in your community. Programs like Big Brother and Big Sister are so effective at reaching at-risk children. Outreach at church or, in other community organizations, right? Volunteering makes such a difference. Supporting, organizations that work globally. If you're, able, donations certainly matter when you're working for a nonprofit. And also, like you said, being conscious of, where we are in the world and what the impact that our choices have on others, whether that's the chocolate you eat or the jewelry you buy. We live in this world where we don't always see the impact that these everyday choices have on people across the world, and including children. So I think that's as you said, there's so many websites and so many ways out there that you can figure out ethical sources of clothing and ethical sources of food, and it truly makes a difference. So I think that's all right on. And, if everybody is a little bit more mindful of how our actions impact others, we could have a larger impact on making the world a better place.
Oh, that is just so beautiful. I think even just leaving the four walls, if we have resources, the four walls of our country can be life-changing. And the fact that you left our country and saw, it's interesting. I remember when we went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, I just remember being profoundly moved by what I saw. It's as if, the news came to life in this very real way that was like affective on my heart. I could make sense of things that I never knew were occurring. I could make sense of bigger world picture, issues that I was reading about, and it impacted me forever. That this was a long time ago that we took this pilgrimage, and same thing when we went to Syria. I was just, I couldn't believe what things that I've seen, but I think it's only because by God's grace, we had the resources to go and take these, trips to see what was out there in the world. But it has certainly changed my frame of reference in living in this world, and even the gratitude for what we have that people don't have. The basics, when you see children, kicking a cantaloupe in the street because they don't own a soccer ball, and they're doing so in flip-flops or no shoes. Yep. It's just, it breaks my heart. And so I just remind everybody too about the IOCC. I know they're always, International Orthodox Christian Charities is always looking for donations. Are there any donations or resources specific that we can donate to financially for vulnerable children specifically?
Well, IOCC is absolutely one of them. They do work with vulnerable children in many programs across the globe. So that's absolutely an international organization to donate to, but as you mentioned, looking at the United States, I would also say to look at local organizations, what they're doing, whether, local means in your actual town or city or, statewide. There's so much need, just so much need out there. So I think whatever direction that, your heart tells you to go with a gift will make a difference somewhere.
Well, Dr. Ashley, thank you so much for being with us this evening. This was certainly enlightening and I know an encouragement and a resource for people across the globe who are thinking about adopting or have adopted and who know friends who've adopted. So we thank you for being with us tonight. We want to thank all of our listeners once again for tuning into Live with the Louhs. We're thankful that you could be with us. We encourage you to look ahead to March 19th. Our latest book is being released, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, and we certainly hope that you'll take advantage of getting your copy sooner than later. And we want to remind you of Dr. Ashley's book. If you enjoyed listening to her this evening, it is available through Ancient Faith, and it is entitled Children of My Heart. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to connecting next Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.